Hi, this is Jose Luis here at Parametric Camp, and in this video I would like to introduce you to the C# script component and delve a little deeper in how it works, how do we customize the inputs, how do we customize the outputs, how do we write code inside of it, and then start writing our very early first Grasshopper native components. Sorry, not native, the scripted components, all right? And just a reminder, in this series, Advanced Development in Grasshopper, I'm going to assume that you're already familiar with the C# programming language. And if you're not, you're more than welcome to check any of our resources, like the Learning C# playlist that should have a link on the description and maybe a card popping up somewhere over there. And I'm going to assume that you're familiar with the language, so I'm going to focus on how do we actually develop using that language in the scripting components, all right? All right, so let's first start by taking a closer look at the component and acknowledging that it has, as any other Grasshopper component, it has some inputs on the left, it has some outputs on the right, and it has this special output called out, which I'm going to talk about in a second. And it is special in the sense that if we zoom out, we just see the inputs and the outputs, but if we zoom in, we can see that we can add more outputs, more inputs, we can add more outputs, and we can actually right click on them and say, like, for example, and change their names. So for example, input one, or I could change one like my input, etc. Right? And for the outputs, I could also say, for example, I'm going to right click on the output and say amazing output, and this is going to be super cool geometry. All right? So I can customize the names of the inputs and the outputs. So, but how do I actually script or do anything with this component? Well, we can double click on the component, and then what we will get is this development environment, like the script editor, which will allow us to write computer code inside of this component, all right? And if you're familiar with C#, you're going to be familiar with many of the things that you're going to see here. So I'm actually going to expand all the regions here so that you can see them full on, all right? And then what you can see is that, first of all, what we have here in this window is a class that is inheriting from Grasshopper script instance. But you can see that we're using some libraries, so the system libraries, Rhino libraries, and some Grasshopper libraries. You're seeing that the script instance that we're working with has some fields, so it has like print methods, it has access to Rhino common, cooperation, blah, blah, blah. So I will explain many of these in the next videos. You don't have to take care, you don't have to worry about them right now. So I'm going to hide these members because what I would like you to focus mostly for the beginning is on this method that we have here called runScript, all right? RunScript is the main function that exists in every C# script component, and it's the function that is going to contain the code that is going to be executed every time this Grasshopper component updates. So you know how when we change sliders and when we change data, all the components that are connected to that data, they update and they change? So whatever code we write here is going to be the code that is going to be executed with each one of those updates. So here, I write my main update code, all right? And we will do that very soon. What I would also like to, highlight here is that if you are familiar with C#, you can notice that this is a method, it's a function. It gets executed by calling it, and probably something inside of Grasshopper, the Grasshopper kernel, the Grasshopper engine, whatever takes care of going over all the components, looking at the runScript method and executing it. We don't need to take care of that. Grasshopper takes care of that. But what we need to take care of is that the fact that each one of these methods actually has a bunch of arguments. So you can see that this method has X, it has as an input, it has Y as an input, it has Z as an input, input one, my input. And if you remember, those are the ones that I customize right here. And then it also has outputs, but the outputs are, and this is the first thing that might be a little confusing, is that the outputs, because they are multiple, they are treated by this method as reference outputs that are passed as arguments here. So you're going to see that the outputs are actually part of the arguments of the function. They are given as arguments. And then what we have to do in order to output information to them, we just have to use these arguments as references in our main code. All right? I will show you how to use that in a second. Don't worry about that. So let's take a look at a very simple example. I'm going to actually remove this component that got a little complicated, and I'm just going to drop a new fresh one. And I'm going to connect a couple panels. I'm going to connect a panel here to the A output. All right. And I'm going to connect another one to the output, which I will get to very soon. All right. So for this component, you can see that I haven't modified the inputs or the output. So when I double click, you can see that the run script component is very simple. It just has the two inputs, X and Y, and it has one output, A. By the way, I'm scrolling in and I'm zooming in by pressing Control and by using the mouse wheel in my mouse. All right, that's how I'm zooming in to make it more visible. And then what we can do is we can start writing our own code here. So what I said before is that outputs are treated as referenced arguments. So what that means is that in order to output anything out of this component, the only thing that I need to do is I need to assign a value to the object A. And because by default, outputs are always going to be the generic object, I don't need to care about whether if that's a string, a list, an integer, whatever, it doesn't matter. This will be able to take any kind of object that I give it. So, for example, let's say that I'm going to say that the output should output hello world as a string. All right. So the only thing that I need to do is I need to say A equals hello world as a string and a semicolon. I'm going to dock this here on the left hand side, and then I'm going to hit the run script button. You can see that the run script button, what it did was under the hood, it compiled this code and then it executed the code once. And then what I'm getting out is that from the A output, I'm getting the hello world output here, right? How awesome is that? Let me do another thing. So I'm going to add a second output. I'm going to second output, and this is going to be B. But now you notice that this was not added right away here to the function. I still don't have B. When I add inputs and outputs, I actually have to close the window and open it up again so that it refreshes with the new inputs and the new outputs. So the new output is going to be B, is going to be, for example, the result of 1 plus 3. Let me see if that works. So I'm going to copy paste this panel here, and then B is now going to be number 4. Beautiful. And then, so that's great. And then let me add another output here. C is going to be, for example, what is C going to be? C is going to be the square root. You can see how as I am typing math dot, I get some recommendations. So square root, I get some IntelliSense recommendations about what I can use. So that's going to be the square root of 25, for example. And the result of that will hopefully be the number 5. Is that correct? Beautiful. It is the number 5. Okay. So outputting data from a component is just as simple as assigning some value to the A, B, C, or whatever names we have for the component. And this is a process that will typically happen all the way at the end of the component once we have done all of our crunching of the data. Okay? But now, of course, what we want to do is we probably want the outputs to be somehow related to input data that is coming from into the component, right? Right now, hello world 4 and 5 are basically hard-coded. No matter what I plug in here, it's always going to be the same output. So what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to drop here a couple numbers, right? For example, in the input and the output, and I want to be able to read those values. And then, for example, this be the addition. Let me, for example, let me be a little more specific. Let me be this is going to be called the sum, and this is going to be called square root. And you can see that I'm getting errors right away. And these errors are because since I have changed the name of the outputs, you can see that B and C do not exist anymore because I changed the name. So B should now be the value number, the name sum, and this should be square root. And if I run this code now, you can see that everything goes back to normal. Okay? So now what I want to do is I want to be able to read these two values and then to operate with them. So this should be the addition of these two, and this should be the square root of one of them, for example. So what I could do is I could probably say, well, if I have x and y as inputs, I can probably do this. I can probably do x plus y, correct? And if I do that, it doesn't work. Now, why it doesn't work? Let's first of all see why, how can we know about the errors that we're having? First of all, you can see that the component goes red right away, right? So we can click here on the bubble and see that the error message is that the operator plus cannot be applied to two objects of the type object, which we will learn what that means in a second. But you can also see that that very same error message, I'm getting it through this special out parameter, output that is coming out of the component. This output is a very, very special output from scripting component, which I would like you to think of it as a console. It's basically a console that is used to dump information. We will learn how to be able to print some information to the console and do some write line, etc., etc. But it's very useful because it gives us like this console-like environment where we can see error messages, warning messages, or we can print our own messages ourselves. So it's always super, super helpful to keep a panel connected to the out for reading errors, but also for us to print some intermediate data. Okay, so now let's take a look at what is the problem here. I cannot add two objects of the type object and object. What does that mean? Well, if I go back to my Grasshopper script, you can see that the inputs for this function are x and y, so that is fine. But however, the type of this data is object and object. What that means is that by default, when I create new inputs for C# script components, the type for those inputs is the generic object. And the generic object, we haven't really talked about that, but it's basically the most base object that every other type inside of C# inherits from. What the good thing about that is that this typically gives us some flexibility. The bad thing is that C# doesn't know if these are integers, doubles, strings, whatever, out of the blue. So what we need to do is that we actually need to be able to customize that the input of these two components need to be double numbers instead of strings or instead of the generic object. How can we do that? We can do that by right-clicking on the input and noticing that there's a few things that we can actually customize. So there's a few things that we can customize. So for example, the type of the input, we can customize it here by saying, well, instead of being the generic object, which is what it is right now, you can see that we have a whole list here of Boolean, integers, doubles, strings, datetime, IDs, etc. We also have like geometrical types, point, vector, boxes, transforms, lines, curves, etc., etc., which we are going to see very soon. But for the time being, in the next 2 or 3 videos, we're going to stick to vanilla baseline root C# types. So if I want this input to be of the type number, so I probably want to choose a double here. And for y, I also want to choose that this has to be of the type double. And look at what just happened. So the component started working right away. And if I double click, you can notice that the scripting component has replaced these object types from object to double. You could say like, oh, Jose, why don't you just type that in here? Well, any grayed area inside of the C# script component does not allow me to overwrite it. So I can only overwrite whatever it's clear white. So those modifications, I cannot do them manually by typing. I actually have to go in and select options from the menu. All right. Another option that will be super important, but we're not going to talk about yet, is the access type. All right. What that means is that we can choose those inputs to accept just single items, and this is how we're going to work by default in the next few videos until we get into lists. Or we can choose to have that input be lists, and therefore what we get is, instead of just one number, we're turning that input into a list of numbers. Or we can choose to have that input be of the access type data tree. And therefore, if I double click, you can see that now what I have here is a data tree of double elements, which data trees is not part of the C# basic, is part of what Grasshopper gives us. And I will explain in detail what data tree structures are, how they work, and why they are so interesting. So for the time being, we're always going to be working with item access by default because we want to work with individual elements one at a time. All right. But now that we have set both of these to be doubles, then we can just double click. You can see that these are doubles and will be treated as doubles. And we have no problem in now saying that this is going to be the square root of x, for example. And the square root of x happens to be very close to the number pi. Right? So that's very interesting. All right. I could add more. For example, I could add, for example, multiplication, and then you can probably guess how, if I do that, then multiplication is going to be x times y. And if I run that and I hit and I plug a panel here, you can see that that's the number 100. Okay, beautiful. So that was actually pretty easy, right? What I want to show you before we move on is to how to actually print some custom information here into the output. And then the way that's going to work is that we have access to a special function inside of the C# script component, which is called print with uppercase. And you can see that print can take any text object, but it can also take any object with arguments. So for example, here we can say hello message to the console. All right. And if I do that, you can see that I'm printing this over here. Just a word of warning, print as a function can only take strings. It has no overloads for integers, doubles, whatever, etc., etc. So if I wanted to print, for example, the value of x, I will probably get an error because it tells me that the argument in line 59, so that's this one, cannot be converted from the type double to the type string. So this is a little annoying if you ask me, but the workaround to this is to always make sure that if you're just printing the number, then what you can do is you can just use the ToString method to convert whatever this is to a string and then give it to the function, and you have it here. Or what you can do is you can use the trick of combining it with another string so that that conversion happens automatically. So you can say, for example, first input value was, that's a string, and then if I combine it with x, then x will automatically be converted to a string. All right, so you can see first input value was the number 10. Okay. All righty. And another thing that I like a lot is that C# script components, just like any component in Grasshopper, the name can be overwritten. So for example, here I can say this component is going to be mix bag component, for example, and then if I use the paint bucket, it's going to override the C# icon and it's going to write text. You know that I'm a huge icon fan, but when it comes to C# script components, if you don't use names, that there's no way of seeing how they work differently, right? So actually for C# script components, this is the exception, and I like to use text much better for these ones myself. It's just a personal preference, all right? All right, so I think with this is where I wanted to, this is enough for a quick introduction on how to use C# scripting. And inside of Grasshopper, and then how to use simple arithmetic and simple operations with vanilla C#. We're not going to touch geometry yet. That's going to happen in 2 or 3 videos, okay? So I think what I would like to do next is I would like to spend some time just making a few examples and start prototyping that plugin that we're going to be building incrementally throughout this series. So let's do that in the next video. But remember, in the meantime, if you like what you see, maybe like this video, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications to see when we go live and all those things. Thank you very much, and see you on the next video where we're going to do a little bit of practice, hands-on exercises.